Welcome back, listeners, to Empires of India, from Mughals to the British Raj. In today's episode, we're diving into a topic that's a little less talked about, but equally significant in understanding the full scope of British rule in India: its cultural impact.
That's right. We often think about British rule in terms of exploitation, trade, and plunder, but there's another side to the story. British colonial policies also transformed Indian society, education, and language in ways that left a complex legacy.
Exactly. And the British were extremely strategic when it came to shaping Indian culture. Their education policies, social reforms, and language policies were all part of a broader plan to control and influence Indian society on a deep cultural level.
Yes, it wasn't just about managing the land and economy. The British aimed to change the very fabric of Indian society. So, today, we'll be looking at how their policies impacted the education system, the language of governance, and the social structures of India.
Let's begin with education. Before the British arrived, India had a rich tradition of education, especially in the fields of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. But British policies drastically changed the educational landscape.
Yes, and this was one of the most significant cultural shifts. The British introduced a Western-style education system that was completely different from India's traditional Gurukul system and the madrasas that focused on Islamic teachings.
The British didn't want to educate all Indians, though. Instead, they aimed to create a small class of educated Indians who could serve as intermediaries between the British rulers and the common people.
This new class of educated elites was trained in British ideals, including British literature, history, and most importantly, the English language. Lord Macaulay's famous Minute on Education in 1835 set the tone for this transformation.
Macaulay believed that India's rich cultural and educational traditions were inferior to British culture. In his Minute, he advocated for the promotion of English over traditional Indian languages, and he pushed for the creation of an English-speaking Indian elite that would help administer British rule.
This policy had a far-reaching impact. The education system, with its focus on English and British curricula, created a new class of people who were disconnected from their indigenous cultures and traditions. They were fluent in English, but often unfamiliar with their own languages or histories.
Yes, and over time, this class became known as the Babus. They were educated, but their education didn't necessarily equip them to lead or connect with the masses. They became the key players in administering British rule, but they also became alienated from the wider Indian society.
It was a classic divide and rule tactic. By creating a class that was more loyal to the British, the colonizers ensured that they had people to help manage their empire, while also making sure the masses stayed unaware and disconnected from their own heritage.
Now, let's talk about language. The British East India Company's decision to make English the medium of instruction fundamentally altered the linguistic landscape of India.
And it wasn't just about teaching English to a few elites. English became the language of governance, law, and education. It was introduced in schools and colleges across India, but only the privileged few could afford this kind of education.
And this, in many ways, sidelined India's indigenous languages. Persian, which had been the language of administration under the Mughals, was replaced by English. Hindi, Bengali, Tamil, and other regional languages were pushed to the periphery.
Yes, this shift in language had long-lasting effects. The use of English became a marker of social status. If you were educated in English, you were considered part of the elite. But for many Indians, this was an insurmountable barrier.
It's fascinating because on one hand, English opened doors to new opportunities. It gave some Indians access to global ideas, science, and literature. But on the other hand, it created a stark division between the educated elite and the majority of the population who spoke regional languages.
And the irony is, even though English became the language of power and education, it was still a language of the colonizers. The British used it to impose their rule, and over time, it became ingrained in Indian society, even after independence.
That's true. Even today, English remains a vital part of India's educational and professional landscape. It's both a unifying and dividing force.
Let's now turn to social changes. The British didn't just influence the education system and language. They also had a profound impact on social structures and practices.
That's one of the most notable changes was in the realm of social reform. The British introduced laws to regulate some of India's traditional social practices, many of which were seen as cruel or outdated in British eyes. Sati, for example, the practice of a widow self-immolating on her husband's funeral pyre, was banned by Lord William Bentinck in 1829.
Yes, and this was a major moment in British social reform in India. While the British claimed to have enacted these reforms out of a sense of benevolence, they also justified their rule as being necessary to civilize Indians and rid them of barbaric practices.
It's a controversial legacy. While some of these reforms, like the abolition of sati, were clearly positive, many Indians saw British rule as an intrusion on their customs and traditions. This started a debate about cultural preservation versus reform, a debate that continues to this day.
The British also brought new ideas about law and governance. The Indian Penal Code, for example, was introduced by the British in 1860, and it laid the foundation for much of India's legal system today.
True, but it's important to note that while the British legal system provided some structure, it was designed to serve British interests. The Indian populace didn't have the same access to justice or rights under British rule, and the system was often biased against the indigenous population.
Exactly. The introduction of British law and social reforms, while positive in some respects, also deepened the divisions between the British rulers and the Indian masses. It reinforced the image of the British as the civilizers and the Indians as needing to be controlled.
So, when we look at the cultural impact of British rule, it's clear that it's a mixed legacy. On the one hand, British policies brought about changes that helped shape modern India, like education, legal systems, and infrastructure.
But, on the other hand, these changes came at a cost. The British system was designed to create a hierarchy that favored the British, while marginalizing Indian culture, languages, and traditions.
That's why the legacy of British rule in India is so complex. On one hand, English became the language of opportunity, and British-style education created a new elite. On the other hand, India's traditional systems were disrupted, and social divisions were exacerbated.
Absolutely. And while India gained certain benefits from British rule, like a modern legal and educational system, it's also undeniable that British policies were designed to maintain control and extract wealth from India, often at the expense of the native population.
As we wrap up today's discussion, we've seen how British rule not only exploited India economically, but also left a deep cultural impact. The changes in education, language, and social practices have shaped modern India in ways that are still felt today.
In our next episode, we'll be exploring the rise of Indian nationalism and the fight for independence. We'll look at how these cultural and social changes set the stage for the eventual struggle against British rule.
So stay tuned with Westferry Times for the next episode in our series, where we'll discuss the evolution of the Indian independence movement.
And as always, if you enjoyed today's episode, share it with your friends and family. Let's keep this conversation going and keep learning about the history that shaped India and the world.
Until next time, keep listening, stay curious, and continue exploring the stories of the past.